All right. Thank you. Really glad to be here. I'm Bob Staiger, and it's a hard act to follow Lorenzo. He's got a lot of energy, and you know, I was once young too, but no longer. I'm actually a grandfather now, so that's game over in terms of youth. But I'm glad to be here to talk about a couple of topics that are near and dear to my heart that I'm going to be talking about today and tomorrow. The first one, and I did send some background readings. I don't know if people got them or not, but either way, it's fine. Today, I'm going to be talking about basically a book that I wrote that's forthcoming, and this was based on my Olin lectures from 2016. And this is the book's called "A World Trading System for the 21st Century," and I thought it would be a good kind of overview of some of the work that I and others have been doing on studying the GATT and the WTO from an economic perspective. And for many of you, you may have had some exposure to this in your graduate classes, but maybe not as much as other things. So it's probably a good kind of overview to see what's been going on in this area. And then tomorrow, I'm going to talk more directly about two specific papers, one on climate agreements, and then one on agreements to enhance international agreements to enhance the response to pandemics, global pandemics. So those are the topics. And encouraging questions, please feel free to break in. I'm happy to make this interactive. Okay, well, the starting point for today's talk is the motivation that GATT, which is the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, created in 1947, has performed well for much of the 20th century. It hosted 8 rounds of multilateral negotiations, culminating in the Uruguay round, which created the WTO, the World Trade Organization, in 1995. It helped to dismantle a web of restriction trade protections that had been erected earlier in the 20s and 30s. And by the time of the conclusion of the Uruguay round, average tariffs had been reduced on industrial goods down to about 4%. Quantitative restrictions were largely eliminated, but there's been challenges to the WTO, which succeeded GATT as the institution of the World Trading System, which are piling up. And you know, maybe primary among them is China's 2001 accession to the WTO, which has really challenged an approach to globalization that was designed fundamentally with market economies in mind. And the question is, how do we handle a large and clearly economy that is not doesn't have a plan to move to a market-oriented economy. The rise of the large and emerging developing economies in the world trading system more generally has placed new demands on a system that traditionally was really catering to industrialized country interests. And the rise of offshoring and global supply chains may have changed the nature of trade fundamentally. And more recently, the importance of digital trade could make the WTO rules seem pretty obsolete, given that the WTO that was initiated in 1995 was really at the infancy of the internet. And the increasing urgency of addressing climate change raises the question of what role the WTO should be playing in this effort. Should it be playing an activist role, or at least an accommodating role of policies to address climate change? And meanwhile, GATT's shallow approach to integration, focusing mainly on border measures and trying to give countries as much freedom to choose their behind the border measures as possible, seems to be being eclipsed by deeper forms of integration that are coming with mega regional agreements and the like, that are focusing more on regulatory harmonization and that kind of thing. And of course, we're now witnessing a strong backlash against globalization itself from those who haven't shared in the gains and from those who feel that their sovereignty has been eroded. So that really kind of raises a great question for anyone who wants to study international institutions and trade policy, and especially for PhD students who are thinking about topics to write on and researchers, and that is, do we need a new world trading system to meet the challenges of the 21st century? And to answer that question, I'm going to adopt a basic premise from the literature on the economics of trade agreements, And that basic premise is that the design of a trade agreement should reflect the purpose, or in other words, the problem that the trade agreement is supposed to solve. And as simple as that observation is, I want to try to argue that it's actually a very powerful organizing principle for thinking about this basic question. And I'm going to first consider the purpose of a trade agreement in a world stripped of these 21st century challenges. And I'm going to argue that the fundamental design features of GATT were actually pretty well equipped to serve the purpose of the trade agreement in such a world. And I'll also argue that the harmony between purpose and design actually seems like it could help account for the success of the GATT-WTO in the 20th century. I then going to ask, do any of the 21st century challenges change the purpose of the trade agreement? Those answers can illuminate the nature of the challenges faced by the WTO, because if the answer is no, then the fundamental design of the WTO, which was built on GATT, is sound, and it just needs to accommodate these new challenges. On the other hand, if the answer is yes, and the fundamental purpose of the trade agreement has changed, then the WTO may be, in fact, something that is outdated and needs to be moved away from. So I'm going to argue that the logic of GATT's design does actually transcend many, though not all, of the current challenges faced by the WTO. And in particular, I'll argue that the challenges posed by China's economic model, the challenge posed by the rise of large emerging and developing economies and the world trading system more generally, the challenges posed by digital trade and accommodating efforts to address climate change can all, in principle, be addressed by exploiting the logic of GATT's, or now the WTO's, design. On the other hand, the rise of offshoring and the push toward regulatory harmonization as an end in itself may be creating the need for more fundamental changes to the GATT-WTO. And what I'm trying to push at the end is that the best advice for designing a world trading system for the 21st century may not be Mark Zuckerberg's famous move fast and break things, but rather the British World War II motto, keep calm and carry on. And what I mean by that is not that reforms in the world trading system are not needed, or that all is well at the WTO. I think far from it. There are lots of issues. But I am claiming something, and this is what's really, I would say, at stake in what this lecture is advocating, based on the research that I'll be reviewing, and that is that the basic architecture of the GATT-WTO and of the GATT in particular is well suited to guide the design of the world trading system of the 21st century. That's what I'm going to try to convince you of. Okay, well, a key starting point is perhaps a surprising one to people who have not thought about trade agreements or studied trade agreements in general, and that is that the WTO's legitimacy is not built on the case for free trade. I think most people who study trade agreements in the economics literature do not try to build an argument for why we have the GATT or the WTO based on the case for free trade, but rather it's built on something that in some sense is a much more general and robust foundation, and that is the case for internalizing international policy externalities. So just as a spoiler alert, the idea is going to be that if the GATT-WTO is well designed to handle the international externalities emanating from unilateral trade policy choices in the 20th century, and if the 21st century challenges faced by the WTO don't change the nature of these externalities, then the WTO will be well designed to handle the challenges of the 21st century. That's kind of the logic of what I'm going to be arguing here. So let's first think about the purpose. In a broad set of environments, the purpose of a trade agreement ends up being the same according to a now large literature in economics, and that is to eliminate the terms of trade manipulation from tariffs and expand market access to efficient levels, and thereby to provide an escape from a terms of trade driven prisoner's dilemma. So in simple terms, all that's saying is that when countries are choosing their tariffs unilaterally, to the extent that they tend to depress exporter prices abroad, they don't pay the full cost of the choices they're making with their tariffs. And while they're getting the benefits, if they're not paying the full cost, they're going to tend to overdo that protective choice in a unilateral setting. And it's in some sense as simple as that a trade agreement can give those foreign exporters a voice and say, look, we would actually be willing to pay you something if you would liberalize a little bit. And if all countries are doing that together, all can gain. And that has nothing, what I've just said has nothing to do with whether we think that the ultimate goal of a trade agreement is to get to free trade, because we can imagine countries, all of whom are using tariffs for distributional purposes because they don't have lump sum instruments or other better distributional instruments. And as soon as we go down that path, we know that the case for free trade runs into problems, but nothing here depends on that. Okay, it's all about whatever your preferences are and the instruments that you have, you're going to tend to overdo protection for this basic reason. So that's a simple way of seeing that while fundamentally this theory would suggest that that the role of GATT and trade agreements in general is to liberalize. You definitely want to move toward more liberal trade, but it's not necessarily to move all the way to free trade. It's that basic. That's the basic point. Well, it turns out that point holds in a whole lot of settings. It holds under a wide array of government objectives. I just mentioned one that if governments are caring about income distribution, maybe for political reasons or maybe for social welfare reasons, everything holds in a competitive setting. It holds in a many country perfectly competitive world, provided tariffs conform to non-discrimination, or MFN, most favored nation, which we'll talk about again in a minute. Holds for general equilibrium or partial equilibrium environments. It holds for trade in goods and trade in services when governments have access to additional regulatory tax instruments. In all of these environments, the same answer is that the purpose of a trade agreement is to help countries escape from this terms of trade-driven prisoner's dilemma. It holds in models of Cournot or monopolist competition with homogeneous firms, in models with monopolist competition with heterogeneous firms. It does require a complete set of tax instruments, but importantly, not a complete set of policy instruments more generally. Sorry, I should have said trade tax instrument. As long as we have a complete set of trade tax instruments on all the trading sectors, tariffs and possibly export policies as well, same thing holds, and we don't have to have, of course, a complete set of domestic instruments. As I mentioned, we don't have to, certainly don't need lump sum instruments to redistribute. We don't need Pigouvian taxes to handle domestic externalities, etc. It does require the absence of international non-pecuniary externalities. So if we have something like global warming, well, that's a different story, because there we have a direct non-pecuniary externality traveling internationally, and this would not apply to handling those kinds of things. But if we think of most environmental issues or labor standards issues that arise in a trade context, it tends to be focusing on race to the bottom. That I'm worried about your labor standards, your weak labor standards, your weak environmental standards, because if you're getting a comparative advantage on that basis, you can start selling these goods at low cost into my market, and that's going to drive me to have to weaken my standards in order for my firms to compete. That's a pecuniary externality because it's coming through trade, and that is perfectly handled in this. As long as I don't care directly about your workers' welfare because of the low standards in your country, that's a non-pecuniary externality. Yeah, sorry, start from there.
Could you explain why this proposition requires a complete set of trade tax instruments?
Yeah, very good question. So let's suppose that we had a country that didn't have any way to help its exporters, maybe because it was a poor country who simply couldn't subsidize exports, just didn't have the funds to do so. Well, then that country is essentially losing control of the domestic price on its exporters. It can't help them. And it may need a trade agreement to tell another country, look, I would actually be willing to pay you something, maybe with a liberalization of my own tariff, if you would do something that would reduce the exports into my market and help my, or sorry, increase the imports into your market and help my exporters. So it's exactly because if I don't have if I have an instrument on every trade instrument on every product, then I can distinguish my local prices from the world price, and that's the key. As long as I can do that, then it's all about the world price or the terms of trade. But if we're lacking an instrument on a trade policy, then the world price may become my local price, and then I do care about the movement of that. And yeah. Yeah, that's a great question. That's a great question, and I think the answer to that is no. And let's come back to that. But I think if we were thinking about, say, yeah. So and now jumping ahead, but it's a perfect question, great question. If we suppose we were thinking about international tax competition, and suppose that all countries were small, were tiny. Well, I might have an incentive then to lower my taxes just a little bit to get a bunch in of capital in, and we all have the incentive to do that, and we're going to tend to go to a race to the bottom. Well, in the trade context, if all countries are small, as I'll show you in a minute, there is no inefficiency. As long as all countries are small in world markets, you won't have any inefficiency. Even if I have high tariffs, it's for my own local price reasons. So it's in some sense this notion of, is this about my local prices within my economy, or is this about attracting foreign capital that makes a difference? But that's not a great answer because it still doesn't quite formalize what you have in mind, but I agree completely, or I think what you're anticipating, and that is a different problem. And there are papers out there that look at that problem, and they do show that there's an inefficiency even when you have a continuum of small countries, and that's just not true in a trade setting. So hold that question, and when we get to the trade setting, let's come back to it and see maybe there's a way to think more formally of what I just said. Okay. All right, what about design? If that's for the purpose, and it's it's not that often that economics kind of tells us in a vast setting, setting of formal models. And by the way, it's not all models. We'll come back to some that don't speak with that answer. But there's a lot of formal models in which the answer to a particular question is the same. Purpose of a trade agreement is to help you escape from the terms of trade-driven prisoner's dilemma. Then the question is, well, what about the design? If we take this view that the design of a trade agreement probably will be most effective if it's focused on the purpose, then we've got a nice foundation saying a lot of models tell us the purpose is to help us get rid of, escape from the terms of trade-driven prisoner's dilemma. And what I'm going to argue is that the basic architecture of the GATT, including the non-discrimination clause, MFN, and also including reciprocity, which we'll talk about in a minute, and a shallow approach to integration in which you focus mostly on the border measures with maybe a few rules to help you make sure you're not doing bad things with the behind the border measures, seems well designed for the purpose, to serve this purpose with a minimal sacrifice of national sovereignty. So why is that true? Well, MFN and reciprocity end up simplifying the tariff bargaining problem. And in particular, as we'll see in a second, MFN preserves the simplicity of the terms of trade externality in a many country world by essentially keeping the structure of that world price very simple, where it otherwise would become very complicated with discrimination. And reciprocity helps to direct the focus of bargaining away from terms of trade, which is ultimately a zero sum. If we're bargaining over the terms of trade and we move the world prices in my direction relative to yours, holding our local prices fixed, that's just a way of transferring between us. And if reciprocity is a norm in bargaining, which essentially focuses us away from that, and it focuses on what really matters for the gains from bargaining, which is how are we changing our local prices through that bargain. Okay, and the economic logic of shallow integration, it turns out, is also sound. So now I'm going to go to some details and show us, go through this in the simplest model possible. And that is a two-country, two-good general equilibrium trade model. First thing I want to do is point out that the terms of trade theory provides a simple framework within which to interpret two of the most basic features of GATT negotiations. And first of all, it provides a reason why negotiators would view their own tariff cuts as concessions, which they do. They don't, USTR doesn't come to Geneva and say, we really want to help our consumers, and we know the way to do that is to liberalize, so please take our tariff cuts. It comes to Geneva and says, Well, we have some potential tariff cuts we're willing to provide as a concession. That's the legal term. But in order to do that, we need tariff cuts from you. So that's, you might think, well, that's just mercantilism. That's craziness. How can negotiators do that? But the terms of trade theory says that's really simple to interpret. And so let's just go through it. Like take a two good, two country competitive general equilibrium trade model. And I'm going to start with very general objectives, which, whoops, didn't mean to do that. Spoiler alert. Let's see. How do I get back to where I was? I see. Yeah. There. Try that one more time. And I'll try to hit the right button this time. So here's my objective function. For the home country government, it's a function of its local price. So if it's a two good general equilibrium model, there's only one relative price in the local economy. And then there's a world price, which is the untaxed price, the relative price of my export good to your export good. And we each have a tariff. So my local price is just a function of my tariff. That would be 1 plus the ad valorem tariff and the world price, and then the world price. And likewise, the foreign country has an objective function that is a function of its local price, which is a function of its tariff and the world price, and then the world price. And the only structure I'm going to put on this is I'm going to assume that a terms of trade improvement for the home country, so the relative price here is the relative price of the home country's import good to its export good. When the world price rises, that's a terms of trade worsening for me. I'm going to assume that the country doesn't like that. And that, remember, is holding the local price fixed. So that's essentially just allowing me to take more tariff revenue. So if I like more revenue, that's good. That's the only structure I'm going to put on here. And likewise for the foreign country, when the world price rises, that's its export price to its import price. So that's the terms of trade improvement. Holding its local price fixed, it likes that. So that's the structure. And the key is, I'm not imposing any structure on how I care about local prices or how you care about local prices. And that's going to be important because the GATT and the WTO pride themselves in being a member-driven organization. They do not, if you look at WTO and GATT before it literature or website, they do not say countries should go to free trade. In fact, in the preamble and in all of the legal documents of the WTO and the GATT, you will never find a goal stating our goal is to eliminate tariffs and go to free trade. There is a goal to eliminate discrimination and go to MFN. So they're not shy about saying some things we want to eliminate, but they don't say we want to eliminate tariffs. And presumably the reason is that the GATT and now the WTO with 164 members has a wide variety of government objectives that they're trying to serve. And they're really serving as a bargaining forum to hopefully allow all governments to feel like it gains something positively from whatever they negotiate. So with that in mind, it's really important, I think, to when we're interpreting the GATT and WTO to not impose structure on why countries care about changes in their prices. And that's why I'm not going to impose it. And so this is certainly consistent with a national income maximizer that might have lump sum instruments and only want to maximize its GDP. But it's also consistent with any government that cares about the local price for any reason, maybe because of a domestic externality, maybe because of redistribution, et cetera. Okay, well, what do the Nash tariffs satisfy? These would be the tariffs that would be in place when we were just beginning to think about the GATT, so before there was any agreement. And the Nash tariffs would satisfy this reaction curve for the home country. When I increase my tariff, it's going to have an effect on world prices and through that on my welfare. And as I increase my tariff, it's going to have effect on local prices and increase my welfare. And likewise for the foreign country. And now I'm going to impose the standard assumptions of trade that this is ruling out the Lerner paradox, which would say that when I increase my tariff, my terms of trade improve. That's the negative sign here. And here's this assumption that if I have a terms of trade improvement, I like it. And what that means is this term here in the Nash equilibrium on my reaction curve must be positive. And then this term is positive provided that the Meso paradox is ruled out. The Meso paradox in trade says, if I increase my tariff, well, if the world price fell enough, even my local price could fall. That's the Meso paradox. It's thought to be paradoxical, and that's why it's called a paradox. And so we're going to assume the natural or the normal case and assume that's positive too. Well, if this is positive and this is positive, It means in the Nash equilibrium, W sub P, how I care about a little increase in the local price of my import competing good must be negative. And that's what this says here. At the same time, same logic is going on for the foreign country. When they increase their tariff, they should improve their terms of trade. That's an assumption. And there's that assumption that when they improve their terms of trade, they like it. And then there's the ruling out of the Metzler paradox. For them, that's the relative price of their export goods. So that should fall. When they protect, the relative price of their import goods should rise. And if this is positive and this is negative, in order to be zero, this must be positive. And that's what this says. So the key is that this must be true at the Nash tariff choices. And what does it mean? It means that no matter what my underlying preferences are for the domestic country, I am driven to, in some sense, overprotect by this international cost shifting term. Meaning, I actually have local prices of my import competing good, which if I were to increase them a little further, that would actually hurt me if there weren't some terms of trade part of that. Or put differently, if there were no terms of trade consequences of liberalizing, I would definitely liberalize, right? I would do it unilaterally. Well, the same exact thing is true for the foreign country. And that's why, well, if the foreign country could lower its tariff and lower the world price, and the home country could lower its tariff and raise the world price, then the two of them might be able to lower the tariffs together and keep the world price fixed. If they can do that, they can exploit this and both gain. And that's all without any structure on what's underlying these preferences of these two governments, other than all else equal, they like terms of trade improvements. Okay, so that's kind of a, yeah, Eric.
Should we think of these tariffs as bilateral, that is home country's tariff just against the foreign country?
Great question. I'm gonna sort of get to that in a second, but right now we're just in a two-country world. When we get to many countries, that's exactly why MFN is going to be important here. Exactly right. Okay, so good thing to remember is we're in a two-country world here, and I'm just saying in a two-country world, there it is. It suggests that the utility of some kind of reciprocity rule, where reciprocity means, well, I'll cut my tariff, but only if you cut yours, right? That's what we were trying to explain. Well, if that kind of balances out and the world prices don't change, then yeah, we both will gain. And that has nothing to do with whether we're free traders or whatever we are. Yeah. Side payments across countries. Yeah, so you could have side payments and yet you would still want to do this because this is actually increasing the pie. So we could, one way to think of side payments it's very simple in this general equilibrium two-country model is we could also, once we've say done this, if we wanted to make side payments, we could say, well, actually, I want to give you some money. Well, then I can lower my tariff a little bit and you can raise your tariff. And we can do that in a way that keeps our local prices totally fixed. And all we're doing now is moving the world price. So we are redistributing income across the efficiency frontier. And if you think of, if you guys remember from maybe your undergraduate trade days, the Meyer locus was a sort of a famous locus that said when countries are national income maximizers, there's a whole locus of in a general equilibrium trade model of tariffs that would be efficient. One of them is reciprocal free trade, but you could also have one country put an import tariff on and the other put an export or import subsidy on, which by Lerner symmetry would be the same thing as an export subsidy. And by matching those, you keep the local prices fixed or at least equal, which is the efficiency condition for national income maximizers. And then you just redistribute along the Pareto frontier. And that's what you could do here. So that would be a more concise answer to your question. We can do that, but it's not going to lead to efficiency gains. It's just a way to redistribute once we've got the bargaining. All right. Yeah.
Something wrong there. Easy here.
Yes.
How can they both gain? It's a national equilibrium. So what are you playing the pick here?
Yeah. The way they can both gain. So it's a national equilibrium. So here I am. And, oh, jeez. It really wants me to. Let's see. What did I just do? Yeah. I'm gonna. Sorry. Don't know why that does that. I think that's the. I see. There we go. Okay. There. Yeah. Sorry. So It's a Nash equilibrium. So here we are as our starting point. And then this is just saying, well, starting from that point, if I were to come to you and say, if you lower your tariff a little bit, that will lower the world price, and you won't like that, at least to the second order.
So that's simultaneously both of them cutting their tariff.
Yes, that's the negotiation. That's the negotiation.
That's a comparative.
Yep, yep. It's the exactly. It's the negotiation. That's what we have to do. And it's only because of that but why would I not do it alone? Because if I try to liberalize alone, I would worsen my terms of trade, and that, by the Nash.
So what's a comparative solution in fact of that? Is it tariff zero or not
Yeah.
necessarily?
Yeah, not necessarily. It depends on the underlying objective function. But what we do know is it will liberalize. They will definitely go down, but the question is how far down? And that's, in some
So that's
sense,
a business dynamic.
yes, exactly. Terms of trade driven, that's exactly what it is. And that's the definition of what I'm talking about, is all these models. You can put a lot of bells and whistles on this, and they all speak essentially the same way, that at the end of the day, you can interpret it as a terms of trade driven prisoner's dilemma. Yeah. Okay. Yes.
Probably not something very basic, but the reason why you don't want unilaterally to lower your tariffs is because it reduces your income.
Yeah. So
You don't care about consumers that will pay lower prices, but you do care about the revenues of
Yeah.
the government.
Yeah, exactly. So it's the terms of trade effect that is keeping me from doing this. Because if this were not changing, then I know that W sub P is negative, and I would definitely want to lower. But if I lower my tariff, I worsen my terms of trade, meaning my export, what I'm exporting to you is going to fall in price relative to what I'm importing from you, and that's part of my welfare, right? And that's the difference between my welfare under the local prices and why the terms of trade matters is in this model just tariff revenue. It's just the tariff revenue. So I would be essentially losing tariff revenue, and I don't want to do that. Okay. Now I got to the second one. Okay. Now let's go a step further. What about shallow integration? Well, surprisingly, or maybe not, this also provides a kind of an intellectual foundation for the idea of shallow integration in the following sense. Let's.
For us outsiders, can you say exactly what shallow?
Yeah, sorry. So shallow integration, I'm going to think of as negotiating over tariffs. Those are border measures and maybe quotas, but we only have tariffs here. But then leaving our choices of domestic regulation or domestic taxes to be not directly negotiated, but perhaps to have some rules that we'll abide by. And basically, to jump ahead, the articles of GATT, as we'll see in a second, essentially can be interpreted as those rules that you abide by. And then GATT says, negotiate over your tariffs. That's what we're using as legal bindings to give us more market access. And then just abide by some rules like national treatment and other things on your domestic policies. But other than that, you can set them any way you want. And that's what I'm going to do here, is say, well, actually, there's an intellectual foundation for that. You might think, how could that be? We know that domestic policies can affect the terms of trade just like the tariffs can. And if it's about a terms of trade problem, don't you have to negotiate everything? So here's the answer. Let's introduce a domestic standard for each country, call it sigma for the home country and sigma star for the foreign country, that impacts the country's production possibilities. So we might think of this as a labor standard, maybe a minimum working age. That would be fine. Or we might think of it as a regulation on environmental, the cleanliness of the production, as long as it's a local particulate, externality that's not, there's no non-pecuniary international externalities. Whatever that regulation would be, what will be true is those regulations will impact the world equilibrium, because if I tell my 18-year-olds or my 14-year-olds, you can't work, I'm going to take labor force out of my country. And yes, in any general equilibrium model, that's going to impact the world equilibrium. So it will affect the world prices right there. But now I'm going to put in my government objectives as, well, I care about my labor standard, let's call it that. And I care about my local prices. Those are still just defined by the tariff and the world price, because that's the arbitrage condition. And then I care about the world prices, and likewise for the foreign country. And again, we're only going to put on this restriction, that I only care about holding all else equal, my standard and my local prices, if I got a terms of trade worsening, I'd be hurt, and likewise you'd be helped. So now we can ask, well, what are the conditions for efficiency? Now there's two instruments that each country has. So we're going to have two conditions for efficiency, or actually three, because we have four instruments. This one and this one and that one. And what this one is, it can be interpreted as giving you the efficient trade volume. So these are the conditions that tell you, unless you're satisfying these, you're not getting the overall efficient trade volume, given the standards and the tariffs that you're opposing. Whereas this one says, well, whatever trade volume you have, you better be, as the home country, you better be delivering the import demand in an efficient way. And what that means is, well, if I were to increase my standard a little bit, and then I were to change my tariff relative to that standard in a way that changed my local price so that the world price didn't change, well, that would mean that my import demand isn't changing. I better be delivering that import demand to you in an efficient way, right? Like if I'm demanding 100 units of steel, well, it better be the case that if part of that is my labor standard and part of it is the tariff, that if I adjust the labor standard and the tariff, so I have a high labor standard and a high tariff, or a low labor standard and a low tariff, either way, I better be happy with that, right? I better not care. And why should I not care? Because you don't care. You're getting the same $100 million worth of steel exports into my market, regardless of whether you're facing a high tariff and a high standard in my market, or a low tariff and a low standard. So that's the interpretation of what this is saying, is just saying, well, these are efficiency conditions for the domestic government to, for any given volume of trade, to set the standard and the tariff, and likewise for the foreign. And it turns out that the national.
What's the condition on tau?
Yeah.
Like the tau is optimal, choosing optimally.
Yes, so both the tariff and the standard are chosen optimally in the efficient.
There should be a condition. There should be another possible condition on that. Which you are not showing us.
Yeah, there's one for the home country and one for the foreign
That's
country.
That's for the sigma. But there is also one for tau.
I've in fact collapsed them. There's only 3 independent conditions of these 4 instruments, and I've collapsed them into these 3. So I've actually added 2 of the first order conditions. You're right. I've added 2 of the first order conditions for the home country to say all it has to do is get the right trade volume, and then conditional on its side of delivering that trade volume, which is positioning its import demand curve. The other guy is going to position his export supply curve or import demand curve to get the equilibrium world price. I just need to make sure that however I'm positioning my import demand curve, the sigma and tau I choose, if I could make other choices with the same equilibrium world price and therefore position my import demand curve the same way, I'd be indifferent, because he's going to be indifferent, and that has to be an implication of efficiency, right? He's going to be indifferent because he's facing the same world price, and that's all he cares about from my perspective. He doesn't care directly about my standard or directly about my tariff. He just cares about the world price. So if I'm holding that fixed here, I better be indifferent to this, otherwise that can't be efficient. And likewise for him, and then this is determining the volume. So you're right, there are 4 conditions, but there are only 3 independent conditions, and I've collapsed them into 3. Yeah.
So I'm finding some difficulties on this model with what I see right?
Sorry, what do you see?
What, like this choice of efficiency for standards and the actual fight they're having at WTO, which seems like something about judges and stuff like that. That seems the thing that I see as not working currently.
Yeah.
So there seems to be some enforcement problem after the negotiation, right?
Right. That's a great question. And so the short answer to that, and I'd be happy to talk about that more as we go. But the short answer to that, in my view, so absolutely, there's a big fight at the WTO right now over the appellate body judges, and the U.S. has refused to vote for the replacements of appellate body judges. So just to step back, in case some are not familiar, the WTO has a legal system, and it's much like a domestic system. It has a set of lower courts, which are basically panels. They call panels, and they hear disputes and they write a ruling, and then that can be appealed to an appellate body like the Supreme Court. and the appellate body makes the final judgment. And over the last 15 to 20 years, the US has grown increasingly unhappy with the appellate body's role. And the reason is, it's very easy to understand in terms of the legal setting. The US doesn't like the interpretive role that the appellate body is playing. They are acting more and more like a real domestic court, like our US Supreme Court, who interprets vague rules and says, well, you know, this is what it means, and therefore you can or you can't do this. And what the US is saying is, in international law, we don't agree with that. We don't think that the international court should be playing like a domestic court and actually interpreting things that we agreed to under the Uruguay round. That was our last multilateral round, because their argument is sometimes we intentionally left things vague because politically we couldn't agree, and we don't want the court filling in the contract. So that's a whole another interesting area that I and others have done work in that I think is fascinating. But I would argue that the fundamental challenges that the WTO is facing, that's a kind of a different level of challenge, because that one could still be resolved with and you know, without giving up the WTO. In fact, we could go back to the GATT days and essentially have the GATT form of dispute resolution, which was much more informal. And nothing I'm going to say here would change with that. And that's why I'm downplaying that, but totally interesting and also important element. But I'm not going to have a lot to say, at least in the slides, but I'm happy to talk afterwards because I think it's fascinating. Okay, but here, this is basically talking about the shallow part. Like, why would we think that a trade agreement could handle inefficiencies by just focusing on tariff negotiations? And so this is where we get to the punchline, is that the Nash is going to violate, one can show that the Nash equilibrium violates this thing. So tariffs are too high and trade volumes are too low, but the Nash conditions satisfy these. So you can take your Nash first order conditions, add them up, and you get exactly this and this. And it makes kind of sense, right? If you're trying to manipulate the terms of trade, you're reducing, you know, imports from what they otherwise would be, but why would you do it in a way that was inefficient? Like, you have instruments to do it the right way. You know, if you could benefit by having the same reduction of imports, but in a way that could you know, use standards more than tariffs, well, you would have done that. So these things are satisfied in the Nash equilibrium, which, stepping back, what does that mean? It means a really important thing. When the GATT negotiators were sitting there in 1945, 6, 7, according to the terms of trade theory, the world had a very particular problem. Tariffs were too high and border measures were too restrictive, quotas were too tight, and that led to too little trade volume. But the domestic policies were not distorted for trade purposes. All those regulations and those domestic taxes, they weren't a problem. And so if I were a negotiator back in 1945 and I understood that, I would be saying, we should be focusing on getting countries to negotiate their border measures to liberalize trade. And then we just have to make sure that when they start to constrain their tariffs, that they don't start introducing through the back door terms of trade manipulation through their standards, right? That's the logic of shallow integration, right? As opposed to deep integration, which would say, we start, everything's screwed up, let's start negotiating building codes, because building codes and labor standards and everything else can distort trade. So let's just have a world government that negotiates everything. The WTO did not, or the GATT did not do that, and the WTO doesn't. But as I mentioned at the beginning, as we go further and further into mega regionals, there's more and more of that, right? So this is not an academic point. This is, you know, really a question of, do we need that? And what the terms of trade theory is saying is, well, at least at a basic level, the answer is there is an intellectual foundation for doing exactly what the GATT has done, which I'll come to in a second. Okay, so that's the point I want to make there. Okay, so that's my shallow integration point. You could expand market access to efficient levels with tariff commitments, and then you could apply some market access preservation rules that said you can do anything you want to your other policies, but you just can't undercut the market access that you negotiated and achieve policy efficiency. And another way to put it is, market access, meaning the conditions of competition or perhaps the trade volumes, are what you're really negotiating over. And if you can have a negotiating forum that gives you secure property rights over negotiated market access, Coase would tell us, in a simple world, you're done. That's all you need. And you don't need to, to go into all this depth of telling countries what to do regulatorily. They can do anything they want as long as they don't undercut the property rights over what they supposedly negotiate. Yeah. Yep. And it's still true there. Yep. Yep.
Can you just have a simple
yeah. Right. So it's a great question, and I'll try to give you some partial answer to that, which is once we introduce bargaining frictions, then the question is, how are you going to actually bargain? And I'll argue that MFN and reciprocity, the key pillars of the GATT bargaining forum, actually make some sense as a way to simplify the bargaining problem. And we'll come back to that, and I'll show you some data that suggests that too. Okay, so we're definitely going to get there. Yeah.
This argument relies on my country anticipating that when we negotiate tariffs, that your country is going to be making the efficient choice of domestic standard given the new tariffs. But what if you don't? That is, I'm assuming you're a maximizer, but maybe
Right.
your domestic government is messed up.
Yeah.
Then what do I do?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good question. And let's see, so maybe there's two answers to that. On the one hand, from my perspective, the way that the GATT rules work, and the way that I would argue that this partially works, is we would come to the negotiating table, and as long as I can see what you're currently doing, your sigma star and your tau star, then we're going to bargain over tariff concessions, and we're going to get to whatever tariff volumes those tariffs would imply, conditional on the existing policies that we're facing. I did sigma, you did sigma star, and I don't actually care whether that was optimized or not, but that's our starting point. And we agree to some volumes, and then we go home, and then the other rules of market access preservation come in, and we both understand that you're going to be able to adjust your sigma star later if you want, but you're going to have to adjust your tau star also, so that you don't undercut the market access that you gave me. And likewise, I can do that. And in that sense, I'm going to, in some sense, it's an informal sense, because as I'm saying it, I know it's not true, but in some sense, I'm going to get the efficient thing that I want, and whatever you were doing, that's up to you. Of course, when we actually define efficiency, we need to have some kind of objective for each government. And so, it's kind of an interesting question. If the other government has an objective, I could still define the efficiency frontier, but if they were not optimizing that objective, then the question is what would happen. And now I've talked myself into the right answer probably, which is, I don't know. It's an interesting question. Interesting question. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. All right. Then so these are great questions. Feel free to continue. And I'm in no rush. I can always spill into tomorrow with some of this.
Take into account, they could have one level higher of sophistication. Essentially, that's what Eric said. Just take into account that once tau, say for the other hand, tau star and PW is fixed, then they're going to optimize the sigma.
Yeah.
And the sigma star.
Yeah.
So take the best response, and whenever you do bargaining on the tau and tau star, take into account that that's not the end of the game.
Right. And what I'm claiming here is the GATT structure is not quite that, because the GATT says it's not the end of the game. You can do what you want, but the other guy is insulated from whatever you do, because if you change your sigma star, you're going to have to change your tau star in a way that keeps P tilde W unchanged. And as long as that's true, I don't care what you do. You can do anything you want to your sigma star and tau star. If you're not changing P tilde W and I'm not changing my tau or sigma, I am preserved.
So what's a violation of the agreement?
Yeah.
What's agreement is in what terms?
Yeah. So a violation of the.
Say my tau is 2% and your tau star is 3%,
Right.
or my tau is some function of something.
Yeah.
What are the terms of the agreement?
Right. Right.
raised?
So in this simplest model, the agreements would be, I'm going to choose a tau and a sigma, and you're going to choose a tau star and a sigma star. And then after the fact, I'm able to adjust my sigma if I want, but I have to adjust my tau to hold the world price fixed. And other than that, I can do anything I
So
want.
we're really agreeing on the world price.
Exactly.
That's
Well,
what
yes. And the reason that we're agreeing on the world price is because each of us contributes to the determination of that world price by the position of our import demand curve. Otherwise, if I could, otherwise we wouldn't be agreeing. It wouldn't be enough to just agree on the world price, because by agreeing on the world price, we could have a lot of trade or a little trade if we reciprocally went up and down. But because unilaterally, I can't change my volume unless I change the world price. Agreeing on the world price is enough. Or we could say agreeing on my volume and you're agreeing on yours.
So what's a violation of the agreement?
Yeah. So in the,
I mean,
yeah.
what constitutes
yeah,
a
so
violation of the
here would be a
agreement?
violation of the agreement if after we did this, the foreign country said, actually, I am going to change my sigma star and I'm not changing my tau star. And if that sigma star reduced the imports that the foreign country was supposed to be doing, that would be a violation of the agreement. And that's in GATT language, that's called the market access violation, where market access is defined literally as the conditions of competition that we are agreeing to between my domestic producers and your foreign exports. And we think of a tariff as the most direct way to affect the conditions of competition. If I have a high tariff and I lower it, I'm improving the conditions of competition between your foreign producers and my guys, and I'm committing to that now. Now, if I went and I changed my standard and I lowered it, well, I've improved the condition of competition for my guys, and that's a violation because it's a violation of my market access commitment. That's what it literally is in the legal.
Just to, what's the punishment? I mean, what's
the punishment?
I mean, what am I facing?
Right. So we'll get into this, but the punishment ultimately is a really interesting, institution, because you might think, well, the punishment ought to be, the WTO and GATT ought to be coordinating the maximal punishment on any country that deviates. In fact, what they end up doing is punishment is in essence reciprocity, meaning, well, if you do that and you take away some market access, then the GATT is going to, or the WTO is going to allow me to reciprocally withdraw the same market access so that I bring back that world price, so that you're ultimately thwarted in your ability to try to manipulate the terms of trade. That's essentially what the legal punishment is. And as we'll see, we won't talk about this so much, but this is also a really important part, sort of related to the earlier question about the dispute settlement procedures. You might think, what a puzzle if we have this really interesting, international institution that has to be self-enforcing. There's no jail that leaders can be thrown into. And it's all legal. So we have all of this written down and everything. Then we ought to be able to see, the WTO coordinating these maximal punishments whenever there's a deviation. But in fact, that's not at all what the WTO does. It really keeps a lid on the punishment by making sure that countries who are aggrieved can at most only reciprocate. They basically can just pull back at the same level that the first country did. And that goes back to the history of the WTO and the GATT before it, that essentially the worry was that countries were in these huge trade wars, and the view, even stated as a legal scholar at the time, a legal drafter, said, what we've tried to accomplish here is removing retaliation from an article of international warfare to an implement for international cooperation, which I interpret as we're moving that real bad punishment to off equilibrium, which is, that's what really holds the whole thing together, is that, if we did have an outright trade war where the dispute body was being ignored, et cetera, That's what countries really fear. And we could talk about that. You know, I have some interpretations of the Trump tariffs that are along these lines that would be really interesting to talk about. But right now, I'm going to move on. But yeah, these are great questions. Great questions. Okay, let me get to the final thing, which is related to Eric's question, and that is, well, what about what about a multi-country setting? And here, I think the terms of trade theory provides a basis for understanding the nature of interdependence in a multilateral world. So if we thought of the simplest case would be a three-country competitive general equilibrium model, where the home country's exporting Y to its two foreign trading partners and importing X from them. And now discriminatory home tariffs, that's my tariff on foreign country 1 and my tariff on imports of foreign country 2. That implies that there's going to be two different world prices because I only have one local price. And that local price by the arbitrage condition has to be equal to 1 plus the tariff, that's tau, times the world price. And it also has to be equal to 1 plus the other tariff times the world price. So that means that with tau 1 and tau 2 are not equal, we're going to have a world price that I trade with country 1 and one that I trade with country 2. And so as simple terms, we could think that if I have a free trade agreement with Mexico, I put my tariff to 0, and my world price, my terms of trade with Mexico, is going to be different than my terms of trade with Europe, where I have a tariff on. And what that means is the international externalities are now going to be traveling through two world prices, and importantly, it's not just the world prices, but it's the trade volumes associated with, because all else equal, if I'm importing steel from Mexico and Europe, and I get a tariff on the imports of steel from Europe, no tariff from Mexico, all else equal, I'd rather have that volume coming from Europe because I get the revenue. What that means is I now care about the local prices in Europe and Mexico because that's determining the volumes and equilibrium of what they're selling to me, which means that the externality is now a complicated function of the local prices in all the other countries and the world price. And that's going to really complicate the problem. What does MFN do? MFN comes in and essentially rides to the rescue that says, well, if I have the same tariff on imports from all countries, then there's only one world price, and it is a function of all three tariffs, but I'm back to being able to write my government objectives in exactly the same way now for three countries as I did with the two-country world. And everything would go through with MFN, but now each country's welfare is impacted by the tariff choices of the remaining two countries. So we have this world price as a function of the three tariffs. And that's going to be important for some of the things we look at because, kind of interestingly, well, that'll tell us that, yeah, now if two countries negotiated and the other country didn't, and they're all facing the same world prices, then there's likely to be some kind of free rider problem that MFN creates, and we're going to have to deal with that. Okay, so we're going to come back to that, but this is the basic general conclusion, is that if we had bilateral MFN tariff negotiations, which is essentially what the WTO and GATT have done most of the time, that's going to be a setting of bilateral bargaining with externalities, and that's going to be an interesting setting that I'm going to present some empirical work on that. Okay, so that's a long detour through the details, but that's critical for kind of understanding things. So what that means then is, the economic logic of shallow integration and these things here are sound. So I've given you the kind of basics of that in the simplest of models. And the upshot is, according to the terms of trade theory, a tariff is the first best instrument for manipulating the terms of trade. That's really the only thing the tariff's the first best instrument for. Other than that, it's a horrible instrument. But for manipulating the terms of trade, it's the first best. And what that means is, according to the targeting principle, if that's unconstrained, and if that's the problem, then I'm only going to distort the tariff to manipulate the terms of trade. And everything else is going to be efficient starting in 1946, before we start constraining tariffs. And that conditional on the trade volume, and that solves the problem. Okay, one more detail. Hopefully I won't go back to the keep calm and prosper, or whatever it was. But here's a quote from James Meade that I think is really kind of good for this. So James Meade, Nobel laureate, he and Keynes were the key economists who were involved in designing the GATT. And here's what he says. He says the restoration of greater freedom for international trade and factor movements can be made meaningful only by means of international agreements which cut rather deeply into domestic economic arrangements. One cannot hope to see the abandonment of protective devices except in the framework of an all-around international agreement, since unilateral action is quite likely to cause the free trade country to lose more from a deterioration in its terms of trade than it gains from the expansion of trade. So that's pretty close to the Nash reaction curve that we were talking about. And it's the terms of trade deterioration that would stop me from doing that. But he goes on, he says, as soon as any attempt is made to limit protective devices, a whole host of domestic economic arrangements must be brought under examination. Tariffs and quantitative import restrictions are not the only means for protecting domestic industries. Subsidies, domestic taxes, domestic price and quantity controls, nationalization schemes, all can be used for similar purposes. Yet all of these instruments may be perfectly legitimate instruments of policy for the attainment of certain other perfectly legitimate objectives. And then he concludes, if a more liberal international economy is to be established by international agreement, one must search for a working compromise between the need effectively to curb protective devices and the need to give national governments freedom to adopt effective domestic economic policy for the attainment of legitimate domestic objectives. Okay, so that, you know, in a sense, couldn't have made the quote better for essentially what the GATT did, which he was certainly a key part of the negotiation of that. And that is, well, why not focus negotiations on lowering tariffs as a means of expanding market access to efficient levels, and then put in place various market access preservation rules that apply to non-tariff policies and just prevent governments from using those policies to backslide, because we start out, those policies are okay. That's the upshot of the terms of trade theory. That's not the problem. You just want to keep it from becoming the problem. And that's basically GATT's approach. Tariff bindings are what countries negotiate to make market access commitments. And then GATT articles provide the accompanying market access preservation rules. And here's Petersman, one of the legal scholars of GATT, saying, the function of most GATT articles, such as Article 1 through 3 and 11, is to establish conditions of competition and to protect trading opportunities. So that's the kind of legal backup to what I'm saying. All right. Okay. So let's look at the evidence. Yeah.
Can I just ask, how do customs unions fit into this? Because if you and I form a customs union, you might say, all right, that might cause our tariffs between each other to be zero.
Yeah.
But we're not producing tariffs for other countries.
Right.
That allows customs unions.
Yeah, so really interesting question. And again, there's a sort of a nuanced answer. Definitely GATT and the WTO allow customs unions and free trade agreements. So customs unions are like the EU. You drop your tariffs internally to zero, and then you harmonize your external tariffs. So all of those countries have the same external tariff to third parties. Free trade agreements, you drop your internal tariffs to zero, but you don't harmonize. So the NAFTA is a free trade agreement. The US has different tariffs on Europe than Mexico has on Europe. So the GATT allows both of those. And the short answer to your question is that the terms of trade theory suggests that customs unions actually could be consistent with efficiency if the objectives of the governments within the customs unions are essentially identical, because then it's sort of like the US taking its 50 states and saying, you know, now we want to think of ourselves as a federal government which has objectives, or at least that's how we're modeling it. You know, you could say, well, actually, you should have taken the 50 states, and then, you know, why doesn't each state have its own international agreement? So we're not even going there. We're taking the federal setting as the object, as the object. And so a customs union is much like the US, and in that sense, customs unions that drop their tariffs to zero internally and have a common external, as long as they have a common objective function, they are fine with efficiency. But free trade agreements, not. So free trade agreements are a problem for you know, the theory would say these are violations of MFN that actually cause a problem, and there's, you know, and they're an important violation. So and, you know, I don't have a whole lot to say, nor does the literature, other than that it's definitely been shown that these are an issue, and the question is, how do you deal with them? And the WTO has a kind of a tortured relationship with free trade agreements. On the one hand, it doesn't like the discriminatory aspects. On the other hand, there are advocates within the WTO and also outside that say, well, free trade agreements can actually be a good thing because they could serve like a laboratory experiment, sort of like, for the 50 states, you let one of the states try some unemployment insurance or basic income, and if it works, maybe we spread it. And so there's definitely that view that's outside of what I'm talking about today, that free trade agreements may have their own benefit actually for the WTO, but formally, yeah, that's a violation, and it complicates the externality. It definitely complicates the international externality that we'd be dealing with. Okay, so what about the evidence? Well, there is evidence, and I can, so there is evidence, and there's a bunch of papers. I'm going to focus on 3, as I said, this is based on my own election, so that was supposed to be based on my own work. So not that these other ones are not equally or more important, but I'm going to focus on these 3, and the first one is a paper with Kyle Bagwell, where we looked at 16 countries that negotiated accession to the WTO after its creation in 1995. And the reason we're focusing on that is we were trying to abstract from the notion, from the point that the liberalization in GATT has been very gradual from 1947, 8 rounds all the way through 1995. And we want to ask the question, does it look like countries that have joined the WTO or joined the GATT before, are they giving up the terms of trade manipulation aspect of their policy, and what's left is just the pure political part, the pure redistribution, or the pure part that wouldn't have been there had they not been manipulating the terms of trade? And ultimately, that's a question of whether they're giving up the market power that they otherwise had on foreign exporter prices when they negotiate in GATT. And the way we do that in this paper, get around the gradual aspect, is we focus on these 16 countries that were not GATT members that joined de novo in the WTO after 1995. And when they joined, they had to negotiate accession arrangements with all of the existing members, and they were asked to cut their tariffs. And so we're asking the question, if we looked at their tariffs and asked what was the pattern of tariff cuts for each of those 16 countries, does it conform to the view that what they were essentially doing was eradicating from their tariff choices the exploitation of market power? And what we show is in a linear model where everything is linear, the tariff cuts would be increasing in the initial import volume. That is the best response. These guys are on their best response tariffs until they negotiate. And in our linear model, it would just be those tariff cuts would be increasing in the initial import volume, which I'll call MBR for best response. And more generally, in a nonlinear, without imposing linearity, these tariff cuts would be increasing in a measure of the inverse trade elasticity, which is essentially the degree of market power, the optimal tariff part in a Johnson-esque sense of the tariffs. So without going into the details, I'll just give you 2 figures that kind of are suggestive of this pattern. So here is for these 16 countries taking their tariff cuts, which were done at the 6-digit HS line item, and putting them into bins, 10 bins by decile of their import volume before, prior to joining the WTO. And here's the percent deviation from the mean concession. And the basic pattern is that if I'm a small importer, I'm doing very little tariff cuts. And if I'm a large importer, I'm doing relatively big tariff cuts. And you can sort of see how that logic, it's pretty striking that the positive relationship, but in hindsight, it sort of seems quite likely that the structure of the WTO would definitely do this. Why? Because when I'm joining the WTO, who's going to ask me to cut a particular tariff? Well, it's only a country who cares very much about getting into my market. And so if I'm really tiny, I don't import much and maybe not, not likely to. Well, nobody's going to ask me to cut, and that's essentially what we're seeing. Whereas if I'm big, then yeah, countries are going to ask me to cut, and that's because I have the market power to impact their exporters' prices and profits. And then this is the same relationship, but now in the nonlinear model, where this is a measure of inverse foreign supply elasticity, export supply elasticity. So the optimal tariff, essentially. And again, if my optimal tariff is small, then I wasn't asked to do much. I basically was left alone. I could just go ahead and do my tariffs as I had before the joining. Jeez. But with my optimal tariffs large, then yes, I'm asked to cut. Okay, so that's a quick summary of that paper. Okay, now to get to one of the questions here, what about multilateral trade bargaining? Now I'm going to describe the results from a paper with Kyle and Ali Yorokoglu. And this is the question of, well, how do these rules help bargaining? And so many of the GATT rounds, they utilize bilateral tariff bargaining, as I mentioned, where requests for market access were matched by reciprocal offers, and the results were then multilateralized according to MFN. So the way that the first 5 rounds and then the Uruguay round, and in fact the Doha round, they never got that far, but a similar kind of bargaining setting was going to occur. Was these bargains were bilateral. So countries simultaneously were coming together and saying, I would like you to cut these 400 tariffs, and that's my request. And then my offer to you is, I will cut these 30 tariffs. And I do that with Eric, and I do that with you, and with Lorenzo, and we're all doing that. And those are the requests and offers simultaneously. And then we go ahead and we go into a room and we bargain. So those first initial requests and offers are actually all public in most of these rounds to all of us. And then we go into rooms and we start bargaining back and forth. And eventually we come out, and in the early rounds, it took 8 months, maybe a year. Now it's expanded to quite a bit longer. But what we're looking at in this paper is a very early round when it took approximately 8 months to do this kind of bargaining. And you might think that, well, okay, there's a lot of room for strategic behavior. I might say to you, I want you to cut all these tariffs by a whole lot, and I'm going to give you only a little bit because that's my bargaining position. I think I can extract from you, and you might do similar to me. And then we get in a room and bargain, and we're trying to figure out who's really eager for a deal and who's willing to wait, et cetera. According to the terms of trade theory, if negotiations satisfy MFN and if they also satisfy reciprocity, then in principle, these strategic considerations can be completely eliminated. And here's why. Okay, it's going to be MFN. I'm going to get in a room with Eric, and I'm asking him to cut his tariffs a certain way, and I'm going to offer to cut my tariffs a certain way. But first thing is, well, if it's MFN, if we do reciprocity, so if a norm is, we expect reciprocity. So if you're going to ask me to cut my tariffs by a certain amount on a certain number of goods, you better be offering me essentially the reciprocal, so that I expect my export volume to increase by the same amount as my import volume. That's the reciprocity norm. And if we do that, remember from the earlier slide, that's going to hold the world price fixed. So right away, we have cut out the worry about Lorenzo, who's not in the room, because that was the only way the externality to third parties was going to travel through the world price effect. So if Eric and I are doing reciprocity, now these are bilateral negotiations without any third party externalities, which is a first major benefit of an MFN negotiation if you're going to try to bilateralize these bargains. Okay, the second is, well, all right, now if we're doing bargaining, Eric and I, and we've already determined that the norm says the terms of the deal are fixed. It's you want $300 million worth of imports into my market or exports in my market, you better be willing to give me $300 worth of imports into your market. So that term's fixed, but still what's not necessarily fixed is the depth. Like you might want 300, and I might want 1,000. Like I might really want to liberalize reciprocally, so there's still that. Well, the second aspect of reciprocity, which I haven't mentioned yet, is reciprocity in the other direction. And that is, if we suppose that Eric was a really strong bargainer and he pushed me to go to, let's say he was the one who wanted 1,000 and I just wanted 300, but at the end of the day, he pushed me to 1,000. So we both reciprocally offered each other 1,000, tariff cuts that led to 1,000 units of increased exports into each other's market. Well, when I come back home, either now or in a year, I have the freedom to renegotiate under the GATT rules. And that renegotiation says I have to now engage Eric for a reasonable period, like 3 months. But if at the end of the day, Eric is not willing to take my offer of, I want to back off on what I gave, but I'll give you some other stuff. Maybe I'm trying to give you stuff that's garbage. You don't care about it. You potentially could hold me up, right? You could say, no, we had a deal and I'm not agreeing to the renegotiation. Well, under GATT Article 28, you can't hold me up. The GATT article says, if we decide later, if any of us decide later that we negotiate we didn't like, I can go ahead unilaterally after trying to renegotiate with you and get you to agree to something else, to go ahead and just reduce my tariffs as I want. And then you are allowed to reciprocate. All you can do is reciprocally go back up to the level that I want back up. So what that means is, one way or another, the world price isn't going to change, because negotiating down, we had that norm. And now if I say I don't like the depth, we're going to negotiate back up. But what that means is there's nothing left to negotiate for, because the terms are fixed by reciprocity going down. And the depth is fixed by the one who wants the least deal is going to get it, because one way or another, you could try to push me, but I'll just back off later. So what that then means is there's no strategic bargaining behavior left, right? According to that very specific interpretation. If you're really holding yourself to MFN, reciprocity going down as the norm and reciprocity going up under Article 28 renegotiation, the market access bargaining just becomes like a retail store. You just walk in and say, here's the amount of market access I want. I know the price, and this is the quantity I want. Nobody can give me more than, and nobody can force me that more than that. I may not get that much, because maybe you'll stock out and I won't be able to buy those blue jeans. I wanted 6 pair, I only got 3. But at the end of the day, there's nothing to bargain about. I just take the 3 at that price and I walk out. So that's the simple idea that we try to formalize in this theory paper. And now what I want to do is go to the data. So one of the really nice things about the GATT is that the data is there. The bargaining data is in the basement of the GATT. All the offers and counter offers from all of the rounds, right? So all of the 8 rounds, they've made public all of it except the Uruguay round. So it's there starting in 1947. And what we did in this paper is looked at data from 1952 in the Torquay round and analyzed that bargaining data to see, well, is there a way of thinking, that maybe some of the theory is suggestive in what's actually going on, not just in the outcomes, but in the back and forth. Okay, so before we do that, though, let's, rather than trusting us, let's go to some of the commentators at the time. And so it turns out that the absence of strategic bargaining behavior was seen by GATT practitioners and legal scholars as a key hallmark of the GATT bargaining in the early years of the rounds, and that it distinguished it from GATT tariff bargaining, or distinguished it from tariff bargaining that preceded it in pre-GATT days. When there was bargaining, for example, in the Reciprocal Trade Agreement Act of the 30s for the US was bargaining and in Europe before that, there were tariff negotiations, but there weren't these kind of rules that were set up. So here's what Corzon says, he says of the bargaining in the Torquay round, he said their requests cannot be higher than their offers and negotiations start from this maximum position. So that's reciprocity. If all requests are granted, all the offers will be fulfilled. Similarly, all other contracting parties are likely to make offers which match the requests they have made. So that's the reciprocity norm. As some of the requests are rejected, some of the offers are withdrawn. This procedure has been raised to a gap principle and is not laid down by any rule. So that's the reciprocity going down. It's only a norm. It's not a rule. Although reciprocity going up in a renegotiation is a rule. It's embodied in Article 28 renegotiation. But going down, it's a norm. So he says a convention, but one which creates a much better negotiating climate than the opposite trend, which was a feature of the classical bilateral negotiations. Then everyone put forward very low offers with the intention of increasing gradually if the bargaining proved profitable. A country never knew, however, when it had reached the maximum its partner was willing to concede. Okay, so that's the idea that without these rules, Eric and I could be there for years trying to figure out who's bluffing. But these rules essentially just, according to Curzon, you cut to the chase, and people's offers were taken at face value, and everything was reciprocal. And if you decided you didn't want a big deal, then I took that at face value. I didn't think you were trying to bluff me and getting me to give more and you to give less. Okay, so Curzon then describes a tariff bargaining forum in which there's no point in making lowball initial offers because governments are expecting non-strategic behavior. Offers will be taken at face value. So here's for GATT old timers. So these are countries who were already involved in GATT in previous rounds. The Turkey round was the 4th round. There had been 3 earlier rounds. So we look at the countries who had been around and kind of knew the norm, right? That's the assumption, because they knew how this worked. And here's so the sales are the initial offer that's made by a country. So these negotiations took 8 months, and the initial offers were, I'm just going to look at this, initial offer over existing offer. So initially, on average, these countries agreed to make offers that would have led their tariffs to be 80% of what they started with, so like a 20% cut. And then 8 months later, at the end of the round, there were, whatever the final offers were, those final offers were essentially, almost unchanged, right? And that's this number here. So that's the sense in which, at least there doesn't seem to be any movement or virtually no movement in the back and forth offers that were going on. There were some back and forth, but as we talk about in our theory, that's suggested more by the multilateral balancing to get reciprocity. And what's not happening is you're not getting, tariff cuts that are going lower as the bargain proceeds. Okay, well, here's kind of a counterfactual, right? It's not a literal counterfactual, it's a factual, but here's a bunch of newcomers that joined the GATT in 1954. And so here's what Curzon says about them. Several newcomers to GATT, unaware of this new technique and starting with low offers, found that in the course of negotiations, they were unable to reach the level of request they aimed for. Their initially low offers were taken as proof of their intentions, and they either had to go home with a tariff higher than expected or had to increase their offers in the course of negotiations. So we looked at these newcomers. These are the guys who actually joined. Same data. And as you can see, the sales, these are what I'm offering. There was actually a pretty substantial reduction of their tariff cuts from 85.5% of their original tariffs was their initial offer down to 81.9% of their final. So a relatively substantial movement in their tariffs over the bargaining. Whereas the purchases, I didn't show that in the previous one, but it didn't move. It moved about essentially exactly the same in the previous one. The purchases, moved a little bit, but not much. In other words, other countries were just, essentially standing pat and saying, if you don't want to give us, deep cuts, we'll just take some products off, but we're not going to change the tariff cuts that we're offering you. Okay, so that's a example of the data that one can look at, combining the theory that's been developed for why MFN and reciprocity actually might make some sense and simplify things with the actual back and forth offer data, which I want to emphasize again, is just so unusual in economics that we actually have a huge amount of bargaining data like this and important data. This is not bargaining over used cars or something. This is like literally bargaining over all the tariffs that countries bargained over. So I would really encourage those of you who are thinking about exploiting data sets that haven't been used much, but are out there. Take a lot of work. It took us a lot of work to get this data cleaned and ready, but there's a whole lot of other data, and you could also use this with the other rounds that could be equally used. Okay, I don't know what time it is. I don't have my watch with me.
It's 5:01.
When do I stop? 1. Okay. All right, let me close with this, and then I'll, this is not bad because we've got through most of what I want to do. Then I'm going to move to the new challenges. I'll go quickly tomorrow on that, and then I'll get to these other papers as I might only get to one of the 2 that I had, but that's okay. Okay, so now let's do a different counterfactual. So, what I said a minute ago wasn't a counterfactual. It was, we actually had this sort of natural experiment that some countries, according to Curzon, had already figured out the norm. They were bargaining that way, and other countries hadn't. And we could look at their different behavior. Now let's actually use a quantitative model, and we'll use Lorenzo's model with Fernando Pero to think about doing some counterfactuals. So, and in particular, we want to ask the question, well, what would tariff bargaining have looked like in the absence of GATT rules? And what we're going to focus on in particular is, could GATT tariff negotiations have performed better if MFN had been abandoned? And so it's kind of common to observe that MFN is potentially a bad rule because it's creating this positive externality. If I cut my tariff, all else equal, and I'm negotiating with Eric, well, Lorenzo is going to get some benefit because I'm going to have to offer that same MFN tariff cut to Lorenzo, and unless we're doing reciprocity, really strictly, Lorenzo is likely to get some bleed off of that. So you might think, and it seems plausible to think, that the free rider problem under MFN is a big issue, and that's potentially a problem. So the question we ask is, well, what if the GATT had abandoned, or the WTO had abandoned MFN and allowed countries to negotiate in a discriminatory way? Could that solve the problem? And the simple point is, you might think, and often kind of the policy practitioners will sort of suggest that if you just got rid of MFN, you wouldn't have an externality. But of course, that's not true. There will be an externality if we bargain discriminatorily, and in fact, the sign will change. So now, when Eric and I offer each other a discriminatory tariff cut, Lorenzo is going to be hurt. So it's not obvious, well, is that better than if we offer each other an MFN tariff cut and Lorenzo's help? Lorenzo will be hurt because he won't get this tariff cut that Eric and I are exchanging with each other, and his exporters will now be at a disadvantage selling into my market and Eric's market. So that's the question. Well, it turns out in a very simplest of models, so take a 3-country general equilibrium model, that under discriminatory tariffs, every point on the efficiency frontier, and this is with any general objectives, again, similar to what I had before, any point on the efficiency frontier has to make a picture that looks like this. So what is this? This is the tariff that the home country imposes on country I. So this is my tariff on Eric. And this is Eric's tariff on me. Whoops. Eric's tariff on me. And so here is my ISO welfare contour with these 2 tariffs. These 2 tariffs in place. Sorry. And here's Eric's ISO welfare contour. Wow. I shouldn't have had that coffee, I guess. Big jumpy. And then here is Lorenzo's welfare function. So that's what any efficient tariff has to look like this. And what it says is, Eric and I can do, starting from any point on the efficiency frontier, we can negotiate a liberalization of our 2 tariffs to each other, improve our welfare at the expense of Lorenzo. And this is just basically trade diversion. Okay, it's just saying we can turn the terms of trade against Lorenzo by liberalizing. And if you think of, suppose we were all national income maximizers, Well, then this point would be, free trade would be one point. Everyone's doing free trade. And all this is saying is, well, if we're starting a free trade, Eric and I can subsidize imports from each other just a tiny bit. Well, that's a second order loss, but we turn the terms of trade as a first order against Lorenzo. And that's all this is saying. And this is just general, doesn't matter if it's free trade or not, any objective you want, it's always going to look like this. So what that suggests is if you ever were going to get to the efficiency frontier, once you eliminate MFN, you got a problem. You're not going to stay there bargaining. You're going to go down. And it's pointing to, you're going to tend to over liberalize. But it's not really enough to say that because we don't have a bargaining game here. We're just saying if you got on the efficiency frontier, you would go down, but who knows what you would do. So what we do in this quantitative trade model is we use Lorenzo and Fernando's model and append to that a bargaining model in which we use the equilibrium concept from Horn and Walensky, a Nash and Nash bargain, where we have countries simultaneously bargaining bilaterally. And the equilibrium concept is every Nash bargain, if Eric and I have bargained, it better be the case that our bargain is optimal given all the Nash bargains of everybody else. And we can't do a multilateral deviation. So that's the simplicity of that thing is I can't say, well, I'm going to deviate from what I should be doing with Eric. And when I do that, I'm also going to go back and do more with Lorenzo. Can't do that. Whatever my bargains are with Lorenzo and everybody else, I'm now looking at Eric and saying, am I doing the best I can in terms of this Nash bargain? And with that limitation, which as we talk about in the paper is certainly a kind of a long shot, summary of how the WTO and GATT actually bargains. But with that interpretation, and I think there's a huge amount of more work that could be done along these lines. Here's what we find is that under MFN, the factual negotiations, this is under the Uruguay round, lead to an increase in welfare. These are small increases, but as Lorenzo has told you, I'm sure that a lot of these things tend to be small. But this is relative to the 1990 pre-Uruguay round negotiation. And here's the trade-weighted mean tariff cut. And then when you allow the same countries to bilaterally negotiate with discriminatory tariffs, they indeed go way down. They go much further down into negotiations because you're exploiting this negative externality now. I want to do more with Eric, and I want to do more with Lorenzo, and I'm hurting everybody else, and it just goes on. And ultimately, the world as a whole loses even relative to its 1990. And you might ask, wait a minute, how can that be possible? You're losing relative to the status quo. And the reason is the Horn-Walensky bargaining setting. You have externality. You have no control over the threat point, right? That's endogenous. And what turns out is, yeah, well, given that everyone else is doing this, the best I can do is, do what I'm doing. But at the end of the day, we've just way over liberalized according to this. And it's not a good thing to get rid of MFN. So, whether one believes the actual numbers or not, I think the important thing is this is an attempt to quantify the importance of these externalities and how they affect bargains. And the key thing being that you flip from a positive externality where you are, we show that this doesn't get you all the way to the efficiency frontier. You do stay above it. You don't go all the way, but this gets you way below the efficiency frontier, so much so that you actually would have been better off if you could have all said, let's not even have a round. But you don't have that ability under Horn-Walensky. You can't stop others from doing it. And so everyone does this. Okay, I don't want to hold us over from lunch, so I'm going to stop there. And that's really, that's where that was half the talk. I thought I'd take an hour on that and have a half hour. So probably tomorrow, I'm gonna start right here and start right here and just very quickly go through a couple of these and then leave you to read the rest in the links. And then I'm going to turn to the other papers. Thanks a lot for your question.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. I sort of
It's not necessarily always right, but at least.
All of this is bilateral.
Yeah.
You might imagine that a multilateral or efficient is that
Yeah.
all this or is that
Some of the European, we have bilateral, also hurt multilateral. When they call it, they have it like the Quad, or countries that got together in some points around and agreed on certain cuts, but they then came to the rest and said, okay, we've got these, this is part of our negotiation. So it was definitely a mixture, and too complicated for us to handle on paper, but I totally agree. When you're thinking about the multilateral, and especially now, as we go on and on, it seems like we made these limits to how far the bilateral can go without bringing others in, because they're just going to, and I'll talk about this a little bit tomorrow. I think, the industrialized countries have kind of reached a point with their industrialized tariffs and where they're very low. And yet a lot of developing countries still have quite high tariffs. And so the question is, if you're going to try to do reciprocity, what do you do? And so you sort of have to bring in something else. And I'll talk a little bit about that tomorrow. I think that's basically where we are now, is how to think about some more.
Doesn't the WTO have like preferential rulings toward developing countries?
Sorry, say again?
The WTO has preferential tariff for like
Exactly.
it's asymmetrical, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, no,
Yeah, and so I think that's a really interesting aspect. So one argument that you can make just from a simple lens is, the idea of special and differential treatment was, Eric and I are industrialized countries. We're going to go ahead and negotiate reciprocal, but we're going to extend our tariffs on an Mfn to you, and you're a developing country in 1950 and 1960, and we're going to give you special and differential treatment, saying you are exempt from reciprocity, and we're just going to give you the MFN, and that's how you're going to get some benefits. But then, if you believe this story, Eric and I were reciprocal, and again, you're getting nothing, right? Because you don't change your own tariffs, and you're not getting any more price movements, and so what's changing? And so really the way that the negotiations worked is it basically allowed Eric and I to internalize the benefits of negotiation, the benefits of getting rid of our own tariffs, right? But we couldn't do it alone, because if we tried alone, we worsened our terms of trade. So that's why we needed each other. So we did that in the history of the GATT for 50 years. You were sitting on the sidelines thinking you were going to get something, and you basically didn't get much. And there's a lot of evidence suggesting that. So that's what I would call, with the paper with Calabagno, the latecomer problem. It's now, China and India and other countries. China not as much, because it did negotiate in 2001, but many, Brazil, India, have these high tariffs, and they might well benefit from reciprocal negotiations with industrialized countries. But we've already done well. We got it. So how do you now refigure? And the simple intuition would be, well, what you want to do is imagine if we didn't have a GATT today, we didn't have a WTO, and we were now trying to figure out, what should Brazil and India and China and US and Europe do? Only constrained by our previous findings, where would we go? And that's how, the WTO needs to think, how can it undo some of these restrictions to allow this more general, non-reciprocal, in some sense, negotiation. And that's where the multilateral aspect may be really important to essentially respond to that.
but as back to the court question, like I was thinking, how much there is congestion problem, right? Because what I see from revealed actions from countries that they constantly try to undercut each other. If not, we wouldn't have to go to the appellate court, right? If this was purely self-enforcing, the standard. So that they have to be like, oh, this guy is recognizing. I need to be recognized that Japan, for example, is undercutting me. Can I reciprocate? So now that you are congesting the court, right? China and the US are each other congesting the court, and then maybe the EU and Japan are just saying, then why, if it's not sure that this enforcement is working, why don't we go and set up like our bilateral trade deal with our court system, which is what has happened, right, with Japan, with Korea, with Canada, from the European point of view. But that's what I was thinking. Like, it seems a deviation system from the WTO, either not pushing for the ninth round, or just they do whatever they want. We're just gonna ignore them, and we're just gonna set up our bilateral deals.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, I mean, at least until recently, many of the the bilateral deals still depended heavily on the WTO court to dispute things. So they were still using the WTO court, and so it's an interesting question whether countries, especially now that we've heard about this stop, are countries just going to basically say we can't. We need to have bilateral deals just to get the court enforcement.
That's what I mean.
Yeah.
CETA has its own court system. I think the Japan one has as well. I mean, and it seemed to me that all of these late bilateral deal were a response to Trump trade war, right? Just saying, we're going to get out of this. You do whatever you want, and Europe and Japan and Europe and Korea are going to do their own thing.
Yeah, it's possible. Yeah, that's interesting interpretation. Possible. Okay. Yeah. Okay.
I was wondering, maybe this is something that Eric already asked you, but so we're comparing this MFN thing to the bilateral, that's the counterfactual. But presumably there will be some optimal scheme, right? It might just be very complicated, but it will exist. How would we even, or is there even an attempt to find that? I mean, just empirical. I mean, there will be one menu that is the best given your model.
Right.
But it might just be super hard to find, or
and that's right. So there will be, and I should mention in this particular counterfactual quantitative trade model, we assumed that the objective functions were national income maximizing. So we don't have any political economy. One could add that, but that's not in there. And then given that, we did solve for the tariffs that would get the world to the efficiency frontier, and
with some search algorithm.
Yeah, exactly.
Cool.
And it turns out, kind of interestingly, that because we were holding fixed the tariffs that were not being negotiated in the Euro round factually, and only allowing countries to negotiate over the ones that did get negotiated, both under MFN and then when we allowed discrimination. There were a lot of tariffs from developing countries that were not under negotiation, basically because of special differential treatment. And so, as you might imagine, if those tariffs are sitting there, those are existing distortions that could be undone. And so the actual efficient tariffs were, some of them were big import subsidies, like you were basically trying to overcome the fact. So it wasn't like free trade was the trivial efficiency outcome, because given these existing distortions of other tariffs that you weren't touching, you actually want to facilitate efficiency by actually liberalizing. So there was some subsidization in that, and that was our attempt to get at what you're asking. And but then what we found was when we allowed the negotiations to be discriminatory, you went way beyond even that. Like you just,
And are the welfare gains substantial? Like, is it?
The welfare losses were substantial relative to sort of an equal magnitude to the potential gains. So it was they were definitely large in that sense, although everything was relatively small compared to world GDP. But yeah, it was pretty substantial. Yeah, and one way to think about it, I suppose, another way to think about it, one way to think about it is sort of, what the U.S. explicitly was doing is free trade agreements. Basically, they're